It is March 10th, 2025, and it's being reported that thousands of civilians in Syria have been killed in massacres at the hands of the death squads overseen by Syria's brand new Al-Qaeda leader Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. And yes, I'm still calling him that, even though many in the Western media have tried to whitewash his identity and to act as though just forget about his ISIS and Al-Qaeda linked past, as if that was just a phase, and he's now completely different, and he's not overseeing the horrific massacres of minorities in Western Syria that are still ongoing, as if the West as a whole, that being the governments and the media, are not actively working to cover up those massacres, but just claiming that it's more regional clashes with a few revenge killings thrown in. So where does the situation stand? What is the media not showing you, and where could things go from here? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, who has lived in and reported from Syria. Vanessa, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
No, thank you for having me on, Rachel, during this very difficult time for Syria, of course.
Yeah, I'm always grateful to get your insight. And I know it is, we've talked in the past. I've interviewed you about the situation in Syria, and it feels like some of our worst fears are kind of now becoming a reality. I know you've got reports that hundreds of Syrian civilians have been killed. You've also got estimates saying that there are thousands actually killed, and that the West is now covering this up after Alawite minorities were targeted in just horrific massacres carried out by al-Jawlani's death squads that went from house to house, executing entire families. I mean, the images and videos are all over social media, but will you start by taking us through just how bad this situation actually is and what the media isn't covering?
Well, I mean, basically, not only is the media not covering it, of course, they're covering it up. And they have been since the 8th of December, when actually the Al-Qaeda junta came to power, illegitimately, of course, backed by Turkey, Israel, the US, the UK, the Gulf states, in order to overthrow the Syrian government and to destabilize the country. And this regime change war had been ongoing since 2011, finally successful after a series of military and economic savage measures against the Syrian people and their government since 2011. In 2024, of course, it finally came to fruition. And these ethnic cleansing pogroms began then, not only actually against the Alawites, but against the Christians, against the Shia communities, Shia Muslim communities, even against Sunni Muslims that did not comply with the extremist Takfiri Islam that these factions are trying to rule Syria with. Syria is a country that has never accepted this kind of Takfiri backward ideology. It's a country that has always honored its diversity. It's always been inclusive of all of the minorities that live and coexist inside Syria. And actually, what we're seeing now, on the pretext of fighting against so called regime remnants, we're seeing actually the continuation of the ethnic cleansing that began in 2011. Because just to remind people, in 2013, for example, from 2011 until 2013, there were very similar ethnic cleansing programs being carried out on the Latakia coast, on the coastal areas, against Alawites, against Shia Muslim communities. I was just writing about one today in Bluta, when over 200 civilians were massacred by Nusra Front and the so-called moderates in the Free Syrian Army. And so really what happened is this ethnic cleansing was part of the project from the beginning, backed by the US and the UK. It was interrupted, if you like, by the Syrian Arab Army, by the presidency, by the resistance of the Syrian people against this Takfiri project. But now in 2024, it can continue unabated, and that's what we're seeing. And when you talk about hundreds, actually those numbers are being put out by organizations, or media organizations like Al Jazeera, backed by Qatar. Of course, Qatar poured billions into the regime change war from the beginning. And the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, that's an EU-funded Nusra Front, Muslim Brotherhood partisan so-called organization. It's run by one guy in Coventry in the UK. And his numbers are also always very downplaying of the HTS atrocities committed against Syrian civilians, and particularly against the minorities that are in the media outlets described as part of the Assad tribe, right? And what we've actually seen in the last few days, those numbers are kept very low. Others in the region are telling us there are literally thousands being killed. Entire villages are being wiped out. They have no internet, they have no food, no water, no electricity. And the terrorists are entering these villages and killing everyone in sight. But it's not only Alawites. I mean, today, for example, there was a killing of a Christian faith leader who actually is part of the congregation that goes from Akka in northern Lebanon to Wadi Nasara, the Christian valley close to Homs inside Syria. Maronite Christians have been killed in the last few days. Christian communities that are sheltering Alawites have been attacked and killed. There is a Sunni sheikh in Damascus who was speaking out against the atrocities. He was taken out of his house, he was tortured, and he was executed in front of his children. He's Sunni. So for me, this is extremely clear that this isn't about only the Alawites. This is about the killing of anyone that is not going to comply with al-Jolani's government ideology. His entire government is made up of former Al-Qaeda members, the majority of whom, by the way, have Turkish nationality. So they're not even Syrian.
Wow, yeah, it's horrific to watch, and you bring up some really important points and context there, and it's almost hard to cover this in some ways because you look at exactly as you were saying, the quote unquote official numbers that are being repeated by the media aren't remotely true. Outlets like Al Jazeera are clearly showing their true colors right now with some of the headlines that they have had. It's just disgusting to watch. And part of this cover up is just say, oh, these are just clashes, right? It's, pro-Assad people versus anti-Assad people, and they're just fighting. And then the media will throw in, as the Associated Press did, that there were, hundreds of quote unquote revenge killings. So that's what this genocide is now being referred to, just some revenge killings against the civilians. How do you view that cover up and that decision to kind of try to separate al-Jolani and his new government from his death squads that are carrying out these horrific acts, and to act like there is a separation between the two?
There is no separation. I mean, what we're being told by people on the coast is, for example, members of HTS are usually the first to come into the towns and villages. They're targeting basically the men, the young men. They're killing them, as you said, as Assad remnants. And I just want to address this whole Assad remnant thing. Look, there were for years in Syria a majority of Syrians that supported and stood in solidarity with the Assad government against the Takfiri project that was being funded by multiple countries in the US alliance. And of course, who were being funded and armed by Israel also from 2011 onwards. And how can you describe the majority of the population of the Syria as simply as Assad remnants? It's a country that, any country, any sovereign nation, people are not going to agree politically, but are you just going to go and massacre them? This is the whole point. And the fact is that, yes, the Trump administration has put out this statement that they condemn the atrocities and they want Jolani to investigate the atrocities. Well, what does this remind me of? This reminds me of Israel being told to investigate its genocide of Palestinians. It's exactly the same MO. It's a legal or legitimizing fig leaf to separate, as you said, Jolani from the atrocities that are being committed not only by his own security forces, but by the foreign mercenaries that come under the umbrella of HTS and always have done. And these same foreign mercenaries, these same factions, were committing atrocities against Syrian people in Idlib. It's no different. There were multiple arbitrary executions in Idlib. Members of Jolani's government were responsible for those executions under their version of Sharia law in Idlib. And so therefore, we should not really be very surprised that it's continuing now across Syria. And the fact that people are expecting Jolani to investigate his own crimes, of which he's also guilty of, by the way, but strangely, his rebranding from Mohammed Jolani to Ahmed al-Sharaa seems to have wiped his slate clean, as has the dissolution of HTS as an organization. This is just great. Should I change my name so I can go back to the UK and not get accused of being a terrorist for supporting the genocide in Palestine? Because that's exactly what's happening. And this is completely being legitimized by the West, by the Western media outlets, by the Western UN agencies that are there right now, really producing a cover-up for al-Jolani.
Yeah, it's crazy to me how they've done that name change so quickly to just be like, you know what, the old Al-Jolani was the one, yeah, he was the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria, but just ignore that because now he's al-Sharaa and he's this great Syrian leader who is meeting with Western officials and, being paraded around the UN as if these atrocities are not happening, not just under his watch, but he is complicit in them, as you were saying. And it reminds me of the cover-up that is the quote-unquote Syrian civil war, right? That's always what we're told. It's just a bunch of Syrians fighting each other. But as you were pointing out there, when you have all of these individuals that are now under al-Jolani's command that they have Turkish nationality or they're not from Syria, it serves as a reminder of just how much foreign involvement there is in this poor country. I mean, talking from Turkey to Israel to Qatar to the US and the EU and the UK, how do you see this now escalated violence playing into really kind of the bigger picture and this plan to break up Syria, right? To take it away from what it was under Assad, where you were able to have multiple different minorities and nationalities living together and different religions living all together, but now to where you have this increase in sectarian violence and the West is just kind of standing back and being like, oh yeah, we condemn that, but we need you guys to investigate it.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think, for decades, really, we've been heading towards the partitioning of the region, really, but of Syria primarily. If we go back to 2016, Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, under the Obama administration, was talking about Plan B, which was the Balkanization of Syria. If we go even further back, of course, to 1997, to the Clean Break Doctrine, that was a paper written basically by the CIA at the behest of then, I can't remember which position in the government he had then, but Benjamin Netanyahu, which again was signaling the potential for the Balkanization of the entire region into smaller statelets that would be sympathetic or would normalize relations with Israel in the future. And of course, that's what we're heading towards now, because while Jolani is carrying out these ethnic cleansing programs across Syria, but focused very much centralized on the coastal areas, of course, Israel is advancing even further into Syrian territory. It's taken control of areas north of Daraa to the south of Damascus. There have been moves recently when there were clashes between the Druze factions in Jaramana, which is to the southeast of Damascus, that Israel would intervene to protect the Druze. And the Druze have become sort of a protected minority in Syria by Israel. You will notice that HTS are not going near the Druze. They are protecting them. They are preventing any of the effects that are being suffered by the Alawites and the Christians and other minorities happening to the Druze, because Israel has made it very clear that they will go against HTS on behalf of the Druze. Of course, they don't really care about the Druze. They just see the Druze as a means to actually advance closer to Damascus, to the southeast of Damascus, close to the Shia Muslim pilgrimage site of Sayyidah Zainab, which of course has been bombed regularly in the past by Israel, and then to progress to what is known as David Corridor, which is basically a channel up the eastern border of Syria, linking with the Kurdish separatists in the northeast under the control of the US, but also acting as a settler proxy for Israel in that area, close to the east of the Euphrates, and eventually to link up with the Euphrates in Iraq. This is the Greater Israel Plan, and this is what Israel is basically working towards right now. Now, very recently, which is interesting for me, there have been signs of collaboration between Russia and Israel inside Syria, with Israel lobbying the US for Russia to keep its bases on the coast. Now, why is this happening? Because both Russia and Israel have an interest in preventing Erdogan's neo-Ottoman expansionism. Israel in the east and the northeast, and Russia wants to maintain its bases on the coastal region. Partly also, I think, because it signed an exclusive gas exploration deal in 2013 with the then Syrian government that has never really been exploited. The last thing that Russia wants is, for example, Turkey to get control of the coastal region and to the gas rights, right? So what you're seeing right now, in my opinion, looking at Hebrew media, looking even at Reuters and AP, there's a very clear collaboration between Russia and Israel to basically enable the Israeli David Corridor project, but also to maintain a Russian presence on the coast in Syria. So we're definitely heading towards the balkanization of Syria. I'm not entirely hopeless that it can be prevented, but it's a very slim hope. I mean, the popular resistance that has been battling HTS in the coastal region in particular, but also down towards Homs in Hama, in the Al-Gab plain, which is to the south of Idlib. People have been dismissing them as Iranian-backed or Hezbollah-backed, but in reality, I know for a fact that they have insisted on being Syrian, that they don't want at the moment any external interference. This is a Syrian battle. And that Syrian popular resistance has no backing at the moment from Iran or Hezbollah. And it's fighting against the previous ethnic cleansing that was ongoing since December. Of course, Giuliani is using that as leverage to justify the current massacres that are ongoing. But the reality is the popular resistance, of course, as always, is targeting HTS military. It's not targeting civilians. But HTS, as they did throughout the regime change war in Syria, are targeting civilians. They're massacring civilians. They're not targeting the military sectors unless they actually come under ambush. And this was the MO during the regime change war. Instead of fighting the Syrian military, what would they do? They would bomb civilian areas in Damascus or Aleppo or Homs in order to put pressure on the army to cease fire or to withdraw or to allow aid into them and so on and so forth. So this is absolutely standard behavior by Giuliani. It's not about a military war. It's about a war against ethnic minorities inside Syria to ensure the dominance of what is a Wahhabi Takfiri cult that has been imposed upon Syria by the Gulf states, by Israel, by Turkey, and by the West.
Yeah, wow, it's so interesting to me when you think of kind of the greater chessboard of it all. And, as you were pointing out, it's interesting to see how both Israel and Turkey, right, they wanted to see the downfall of Assad. They want that land, but they also have competing interests, right? They can only go so far before they start going up against each other. And then on top of that, I look at Russia and I go, Russia has been so careful when it comes to Israel, right? Israel's carrying out an all-out genocide, and Russia's been very careful in their statements and the way that they handle Israel, not getting too far onto their bad side. At the same time, Russia is also very careful when it comes to Turkey. So I'm looking at this going, okay, this is going to get very interesting here. Now, I'm also curious too on the end of the US and the UK and the EU and kind of where the West as a whole stands, because I saw reports earlier that Al-Jilani has been invited to Brussels for a donor conference next week. So basically, they're saying we're going to pour money into your government and give you whatever you want. And reward your targeting of the minorities in Syria. How do you see that pairing? And I mean, to me, it's so obvious, this Western involvement, but it seems like so many people are still not awake to this and still going with the same old lies and propaganda that we've been told, going back to 2011 now.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole sanctions lifting sort of narrative is just insane. I think Switzerland came out a couple of days ago saying that it would alleviate some of the sanctions on Syria, while, as you said, Giuliani is effectively committing a genocide. I don't think that's too strong a term. When you start wiping out entire villages, entire towns, a friend of mine from the coastal areas told me, Vanessa, we're just counting the bodies in the streets. Literally, I can't even imagine what it's like and how little ability these people have to be able to communicate, partly because they're terrified, but partly also because the internet is being cut. They're not being allowed to communicate. And even now the UN is there, they're being threatened if they speak about any of the massacres. The white helmets, the CIA MI6 white helmets, are basically disposing of the bodies on behalf of Al-Qaeda. Again, that's something that they've done since they were established in 2013. And so when we see this absolute, I don't even think hypocrisy is a strong enough word for what the EU and the UK are doing. I mean, we had Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. Of course, Alistair Campbell was the spin doctor for Tony Blair, another war criminal from the UK, who came to Damascus to legitimize Giuliani and to interview him in the so-called presidential palace. And this is what they've been working to do since December the 8th, is to completely legitimize an Al-Qaeda government, to alleviate the economic pressure on the country now that he's in power. And the fact that, they were claiming all the time that sanctions were being maintained and increased on Syria, that they were targeting the leadership only, they weren't targeting the people. Of course, now that argument is completely reversed. And they're telling EU countries and the UK and the US, but hang on, the sanctions are completely punishing the people. It's collective punishment. But that wasn't the case when President Assad was in power. No. They were campaigning for sanctions to be increased, right? And so basically, yes, what we're seeing is again the legitimization of genocide, just as we saw with Palestine, when the UK and the EU member countries were basically defending Israel, continuing to supply arms, continuing to normalize the genocide or even defend the genocide. That's exactly what they're doing now. And again, another point to make, which is very important, is that since Giuliani came to power, the EU has closed their borders to refugees from Syria. But during the regime change war, those borders were open to a majority of the same extremist elements now under the control of Giuliani that are conducting the massacres inside Syria. I'm not saying all refugees were from those extremist elements, but a large number of them are, because we're seeing them now in Europe condoning the massacres and actually encouraging the massacres by Giuliani of the Alawite and other minority communities. And so, the hypocrisy to be inviting Giuliani to, as you said, a donor conference, while closing their borders to the genuinely persecuted minorities in Syria and opening the exit routes, if you like, for the radicals and the extremists that were most likely radicalized and trained in Europe and in the UK before being exported to Syria in the first place anyway. There's multiple documentation of that. To allow them to go back to Syria to increase Jolani's forces.
Wow, it's hypocritical all around, and I know that we should not be surprised by any of this, but because we are kind of fighting against these forces in the West, not only the governments, but the media, the propaganda that they continue to put out there, and the fact that they will look at these horrific massacres targeting civilians in their homes, in their villages, and just shrug it off and say, oh, those are clashes. That just happens. It's like these are the things, and these are the things that are being put out there that people are believing. And so it makes the work that you're doing more important than ever. And I appreciate you continuing to speak out and to raise awareness, and for taking the time to join me today to give insight on all of this. Independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you, Rachel, for always giving a platform to all of us to kind of speak about the things that are not being covered.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. This week's episode was actually on the unfolding situation in Syria. So if you want more context and more information about what is being said and what is happening, you can go check that out now. You can also find that episode available over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.